So this panel is the first of our two sort of panel discussion sessions, and it's really intended to help us step back from the opening keynote and sort of propose an agenda, perhaps, for the next 3 days by pulling out the themes, the topics, the questions that we collectively, and in particular this group, would like to suggest are the ones that will be most fruitful for us to pursue, things that we want to make sure are on our radar, things that we want to come back to over and over again, things that are maybe questions we should be trying to actually answer rather than simply entertaining, I guess. And so this panel is focusing on the theory and practice of data modeling in the humanities. The second panel will focus more on pedagogical questions. So we'll be able to come at data modeling from both perspectives. And this is an informal discussion. The panel is sort of primus inter pares, I guess. So, you know, everybody should be feeling free to speak. We've proposed a few questions to just sort of get things going and begin the discussion. And I'll just offer you guys the first of those to start with. And, you know, you don't have to address it in any particular order. You can just, you know, whoever wants to speak up first is fine. And we'll let that discussion proceed, and then we can put the next question in when it seems useful. So the question I thought it would be useful to start with here is, what's distinctive about data modeling, specifically in the context of humanities research and digital humanities research? In other words, what is it that sets humanities data modeling apart from data modeling problems in general? What special challenges or research issues or illuminations does humanities data offer us in thinking about data modeling theory and practice? So with that, we can all sort of breathe for a moment and think, and then whoever would like to start, perhaps just begin.
Okay, I had a discussion with a woman in the plane who wanted to know everything about my life, I don't know. And she asked me, well, I think she understood what I was about to be doing here. And she asked me, what will digital humanities, after she understood what digital humanities was, could benefit from what's going on in, you know, like big data in the other scientific fields. I said, no, that's exactly the contrary. The variety of concepts and domains and objects we manipulate in the humanities will probably make digital humanities very useful for the other fields of science. So that's a way for me to answer. And then I make it short because I've got a few words there. I had common concepts across those variety of fields, abstraction that we need to create across those various fields. The issue of semantic interoperability, which is, to my view, a major question, but seen in the context, and that's the final point of data modeling, seen as a tension between standardization on the one hand and scholarly freedom on the other. And we'll have to fight constantly between those two extremes.
Maybe I'll say something and no one else seems to want to speak second. So I'd like to answer the question, the first question you asked there, what's distinctive about data modeling in the context of digital humanities research? I wasn't sure what you meant by data modeling, and Wendell asked this also. I've always understood it just to mean writing XML schemas, basically. That's what people mostly seem to mean. But I think the term's open to free interpretation. It's really modeling data in the general sense. But I think it's quite important that the modeling of humanities data should reflect the nature of the material being modeled rather than the nature of the technology being used to represent it. And I think what's distinctive about humanities data is that it's not really digital data very often. It's usually what's meant is the artificial surrogates that we create from real-world artifacts, like manuscripts and books. Whereas documents written in the digital medium, on the other hand, naturally embody the technology they are created with. If I write a document in HTML, its tags are part of my text, not that of a surrogate. And this fundamental difference of interpreting features that we see in the text, in the physical objects, and putting it into the text is, I think, the fundamental difference between humanities data or humanities data modeling and the technologies that we use to represent it, which were designed for this formatting exercise of digitizing information for the web and other features. Other purposes, sorry.
So I'll build off that. I think, first of all, coming up with shared terminology and shared concepts around data modeling is going to be a challenge. But what, the point about what we model being artificial surrogates of what it is we're really trying to understand is key, your point. And so I should say that I adopt a kind of really expansive ecumenical view of what data modeling is. So data can be events, actions, concepts, ideas, as well as things like numbers or strings we might consider as more characteristically data. So to give a non-technological example of where I think one problem lies with the way we might deal with this is I think that those surrogates that we have to adopt are often necessarily reductionist in nature. And as humanists, we always rebel against that. And so to take one example, I was recently reading an article by an author in the field of information science. He was trying to get a sense of how interdisciplinary the field was. iSchools claim to be metadisciplinary and interdisciplinary, so he was trying to get at that in some way. And so the way he did it is he actually went to different iSchool websites and looked at what iSchool faculty had got, what disciplines they'd gotten their PhDs in. And so this became and then he calculated that, he created some graphs for that, you know, how many faculty members had degrees in computational science or natural language processing or literature or whatever, and then got at the question through the distribution and the statistics. And so as humanists, we would think that that was incredibly reductionist, that, you know, he didn't think about things like a particular cognitive skill set, someone who's able to translate across disciplines well, how much one actually collaborates with other scholars in different fields. So a faculty member with a PhD in education who actually works with electrical engineers, for instance. So this wide, broad landscape of what might constitute interdisciplinarity was elided entirely in his approach. But I think we're forced to make those kinds of concessions all the time, and I think that's one, you know, one difficulty of getting at the question of data modeling in the humanities.
Okay. So my hunch about distinctive properties of data models in the digital humanities is we have a multiplicity of opinion which we have to deal with all the time. So if we talk about, say, the birth date of some person, or if we talk about the georeference of some text string which might mean a location, we're in a very different situation than, say, a database for tax records or something, right? We don't know if the Paris is here or there. And the second thing is that brings with it a heterogeneous focus of attention, which is very, very, very strong in the humanities. So every humanities research is different, is interested in something different, in a different aspect, right? And that's also different from, say, a tax record database. The other thing is we have a relatively easy kind of way to work with the data, because we don't have to deal with privacy issues. So you know, if people analyze mobile phone records, you cannot go into the data and you can discuss the fact if, like, somebody cheats on his wife or something, right? If you talk about Baroque artists, you can actually go to the State Archive in Rome and look at the entire set of letters, and you can discuss the love life, right? That's also very different from biology, where people can't ask P53, the most important protein, how it was today, right? So it's something different. And the other thing, the last thing, an elimination is, we can actually look at the application of data models and look at their structure, which is a source of complexity. And that brings us back to basically having a common field with many other people. If you look at the linked data cloud, there's data sets coming from all sorts of fields. And right now they all use the same kind of technology how to publish them. and you can actually use the same tools to analyze them. And that's something really, really game-changing, because all of a sudden you can hang out as an art historian in a physics lab and work with biologists and social scientists and find something else you would never ever have found out in the Vatican Library. And I think that's the awesome part about thinking about data models beyond the point in time where we used to compete about XML versus Access versus FileMaker versus whatever. Yeah.
I think I would just want to restate Kari Kraus's point somewhat more pithily and say that as a sociological matter, the humanities are concerned, the humanities sort of live out the modernist credo to make it new. Do something no one else has done. Say something no one else has said. See an aspect no one else has seen. And as long as that is true, it is at cross purposes, it seems to me, with data modeling, which you know, has a different teleology. Which probably explains why I have been trying to saw Lego bricks in half and use super glue for 20 years, right, with these XML technologies and so forth. Yet at the same time, and I think that this maybe to recover this a bit, you know, it's not the case. It seems to me that constraints are ultimately not constraining. That constraints can be productive. You know, that's the way back into it, it seems to me. But nonetheless, there is a tension there that I think will always be there, and hopefully will always be a good tension.
This has been very optimistic, I think, and I wonder, it's maybe a question for the rest of us as well, is there a dark side to humanities data modeling?
I would be interested to learn more about your concept of data to begin with. I think Desmond touched on that, Kari touched on that, and Steve in the end touched on that as well. What's the distinction between data and phenomena? I mean, as humanists...
Or data and information.
We encounter phenomena traditionally to begin with. We don't think of a book or of a play or a painting as data when we encounter it in our real world experience. It's a phenomenon which we process, which we interpret, buy, sell, whatever. When we turn it into data, there is this reductionist step that we take, and it's very important to understand where exactly the reduction lies in. It has to do with the fact that we're talking about digital data. Data is a measurement. We're reading off measurements there. We're turning this phenomenon into something that we think of as a set of discrete readings that we can read off an instrument.
Yeah.
But we all know that the phenomenon per se is not that. It is analog. It has fuzzy borders, we interpolate all the time and so forth. And I think that's the essential tension that we're being caught in when we talk about data modeling, because we tend to forget that there is this initial step that we have to take. And if we bring that back into our consciousness, then we can actually turn data modeling on itself and make it productive.
That's
phenomena and information, as you said, Kari. I think those are the two concepts that we have to group around data, or that we have to juxtapose with data. We have to think in this triple, and that might then answer the initial question: what is particular about humanities data modeling? Because that's the problem that other sciences do not have. Try and discuss this with a physicist and tell him that, no, hang on, what you're reading on that instrument is actually just a reading. It's not actually the radioactive count.
I fully agree, and I think the point about this is, I had a discussion once over multiple bottles of wine where I said everything is a document and the other guy said everything is data. And I think we were like completely agreeing, honestly. Because there's a famous talk by Max Planck where he says everything, so you have to believe in one real world in order to debate about it, but everything else is a measurement. And our measurements instruments, including our eyes, analog, are wrong most of the time. So the question is, what's the bias? And that's basically, if I have to give you a job description of what I'm doing besides being an art historian. I'm a database pathologist, right? So I'm only interested in the bias. And that also brings me back to this kind of notion of data, right? So data is my document. Right now I'm dealing with databases and I'm studying them, but I'm not doing it in a different way than I would study analog data, which is also data, I think. So that's one thing. And the problem is, if you say the most pressing issue I face as a person, I'm at the end of like having 4 years of postdoc, awesome time in the physics lab, generously funded by German Research Foundation. I'm an art historian. Most of the digital humanities positions are written out in social science and humanities departments. They don't hire art historians because they belong to wrong colleges, both in Europe and the US. I'm an art historian who has done too much classical archaeology is another problem within my own field. And then the other thing is that basically the people who actually analyze data, not building tools, not doing the digitization efforts, actually have now, postdoc, have a very hard time finding funding sources. And that said, database pathology actually is personally threatening to people who are firm believers in their particular type of data model, right? Because they say, yeah, it's right, you have to do it this and that way. And then you say, yeah, but if you measure, there's like this problem, right? And that's a critique, and people don't really like to live with that. But I totally agree. That's actually, I think, the future of digital humanities, to actually study what are the errors in our beliefs. Thanks.
I would agree with that, and I also think that with respect to what Laurent was saying, I almost put on a slide, I was at a conference a few years ago when XML was very, very hot, and the big discussion was how are we going to bind data types to XML. And Lou Bernard came out of a session sort of fuming, being Lou. He was fuming, and he says, they don't understand it. They think that text is a type of data. Data is a type of text. And of course that gets to what I was talking about with the nature of text itself, that text isn't just text, and text does have its materiality, its context and culture, and it leads back to phenomena, as you were saying. I think that it's really important that one of the things that I think humanities can contribute to this conversation is something that, in fact, I think the scientists know very well, but which the computer scientists and the information people tend to forget, namely that there is this sort of arbitrary contingent relationship between our models and the reality that we pretend to describe with them, and that very relationship needs to be part of what we're concerned with. And so, for example, there's a classic book in the database literature called Data and Reality, William Kent, where his whole point is that, most of the problems that you get in data modeling have to do with the fact that you're making all kinds of concessions in order to build the system at all to do useful things. And those concessions are going to be what break you. And you need to be very, very, very aware, not so that you don't make the concessions, but so that you're aware of the way in which you're setting traps that you yourself are going to fall into. How is it likely to exist?
Yeah, I'm nervous about contradicting Christoph, but I think you've got the wrong end of the stick, or you're possibly hanging out with the wrong physicists. Most of,
I agree. Sorry, I should have said engineer rather than physicist.
Because the fact is, most of the people interested in some scholarly domain, natural scientific, social scientific, or humanistic, are studying phenomena of one kind or another. And many of those phenomena are analog. And in the natural sciences, people have been conscious for as long as there have been computing devices that they're dealing with numbers, and numbers are abstract objects, and what we're dealing with are physical objects. Not only that, but numbers, the numbers that physicists are interested in are numbers on the continuum, and we're dealing with discrete digital devices. So while it's quite true that one of the central problems of data modeling in the humanities is coming to terms with the reduction step in our digital representations of the phenomena we're interested in, we're not the first people to be there. There is a long history of numerical analysts worrying about how to represent numbers in machines. We often, as far as I can tell by looking at textbooks, tell our students numbers are simple, machines are good at numbers. This is bullshit. There is nothing natural about the representation either of integers or of real numbers, floating point numbers, in current machines, or in any machines in the history of the world.
Not to mention imaginaries.
Not to mention imaginaries. And on the other hand, I have to say, it's not machines that brought digitization into human culture, but the invention of writing. Because what is the property of a writing system? It is the representation of typically linguistic information, language, with signs from a finite set of signs. For that matter, what is vocal communication but our reduction of an infinite variety of analog signals into discrete phonemes? If you don't understand the phonemes, you do not understand what I'm saying. But if you do understand the phonemes, then my slurring is separate. It's not a non-existent phenomenon. It's not intrinsically uninteresting, but it is distinguishable. So a lot of the concerns that people have raised about digitization over the last few decades have always struck me as odd, because in theory we ought to be raising exactly the same concerns over any transcription and any edition.
I think that's a good point. And one of the sort of themes that I'm hearing is that we're talking still about the sort of surrogate model of data. And I wonder if one of the areas that digital humanities has not explored enough is networks and specifically relationships as data. I know that there is an entire field of network analysis and people are studying that, but I think that we're reaching a point where the distinction between data as emerging out of a surrogate and data as relationships between surrogates and between corpora are, I think that those distinctions are becoming less and less distinct. And those are data that, as far as I can tell, may never have had a sort of starting point. They've always been phenomena. And I think that that kind of goes to the point that you're discussing, that all of the things that we sort of hold up as data deriving from a source or from a surrogate, at some point can be traced back to only a phenomenon. And I think that that sort of gives us a wedge into a broader discussion maybe about looking at data not so much as being exclusive to objects that we can sort of affiliate ourselves with, but as being a more kind of expansive idea about the relationships between those objects, where the assertions about those relationships come from, and find ways to sort of serialize that. And there are ways to serialize that. I mean, you discussed them with data. I think reductionism is a canard. I think it absolutely is a meaningless. I mean, there's nothing, as long as human discourse is based on generalization and selection and sampling, and I mean, there's no. I mean, we get this all the time in the digital. I give a talk. I say, here's an analysis of 1,000 English novels, and I have all these English professors jumping up saying, but that's just a selection from the total. And I say, right, not like your syllabus, for example. I mean, it's just absolutely, people have this sense that somehow they're not being reductive, and of course they are. But to say that everything is reductive is like to say everything is green. And as soon as we say everything is green, it drops completely. We should ignore it. We should stop talking about it because it's no longer a meaningless thing. The question before us is,
are our selections, distortions, samples, so forth, are they useful? Do they advance human discourse? Do they help the discussion? That's the only thing to talk about, right? It's not a question of how do we avoid constraint? How do we avoid selection? We cannot avoid these things, not if we want to have actual human finite conversations.
That's a very interesting point, I think. And I think that's exactly why we have to measure before we model. There is this old kind of way how to do a speech. Cicero describes this. You collect material, you find the order, then you construct a story and you tell the story. For 30 years we have ordered first, collect the material, and then we have done nothing. And I think there's a very, so it's interesting, this symposium is called Knowledge Organization and Data Modeling, which is somehow the opposite of knowledge discovery and data mining, which I think is the precondition to do better data models, right? Because classic examples with networks is, right, we found out like most of the data, actually any data we look at, any relation in the humanities, has at least on one side of say, books connected to monuments, something like a very heterogeneous distribution, something like a power law, which is probably not a power law, but whatever. It's very different from Gaussian. That means there's no averages and there's no types. And then you can discuss, the physicists might be wrong to call it a power law because it's not straight, but it's like a curve, whatever, right? That doesn't change the fact you have to actually measure the curve and basically discuss how that goes. And that means that both computer science, data mining for patterns on a smaller scale, and physics as looking for universal laws is tremendously important for data models in the humanities. And we have to simply either do it ourselves or work with people who can do it.
I have the feeling I want to support things that Andy and Kari were saying. And I have a feeling we're talking about text as data without talking enough about what we're trying to model. So Kari mentioned events, Andy mentioned networks of relationships, but the kinds of things that people are interested in the humanities when we don't think about our tools too specifically, we're interested in people, in places, in social movements, in aesthetic styles, form, and we want to think about those things natively. So how do we model that? So sometimes text is the evidence for that, but we're not really trying to model surrogates of text and then we're done. We're trying to get to something else. So a database of events, for example, from a text is a different sort of thing. We're making different kinds of meanings.
So I'm saying Kari is very...
Yes.
So maybe because that was probably not a record. So basically what you're saying is that we should take care that the text is, we're modeling people, events and stuff in text, right? But there's only one thing, we are really interested in the people, in the events and stuff like that, right? Yeah, I think that bridges very well to what Andy said. I think mostly we are interested in the relations of people and locations and stuff like that. And that's a very interesting point. If you look at digital humanities, how it was funded, in the 1990s, the Getty Research Institute would pay you $100,000 if you entered 10,000 records in a database. And the records were nodes and not links. Mm-hmm. So basically, if some archaeologist would have said, okay, these 3 drawings all show the same sculpture, not 3 sculptures, actually you would get less money because that's only 4 records if you actually say it's the one sculpture, right? So I think that's the reason we're interested in the relations, not in the nodes.
Granularity is money.
I want to come back to this initial question about the specificity of what we're doing. And in a way, your intervention, which was really called for because what I sketched out was very simplistic. And we know that natural sciences have discussed this problem of the adequacy of discrete representation. And indeed, you're right, any symbolic representation of something out there in the world is reductionist. But then your argument is also right. That argument is a showstopper because everything is reductionist. Our senses, our sensory apparatus is reductionist to begin with. And if you look at it, on a micro level, you'll find out that, hey, it's actually digital. You know, it takes in so many information bits over a defined period of time, and that's just how it is. And we interpolate between those and we forget it, which is fun. So we live in a non-discrete universe, but it's a nice fantasy to have. Okay, so, but wherein lies the specificity of humanistic data modeling? I'd like to mention two things. One, I don't think that we have in as much a field parallel to what we're doing as the sciences have, that is called applied XYZ. You have applied mathematics, you have applied physics, called engineering or chemistry or what have you, so that there is a sort of a consensus that you can forget about these fundamental limitations and get on with the job of living in the real world. You can build bridges, and you don't have to really worry about the reductionist nature of your calculating machine, because at the end of the day you want a bridge and not a philosophical conversation. Whereas in our areas, I think we're hell-bent on investigating this particular question. That's actually our major concern, finding out where the limitations of knowledge lie. So what is a side issue in the other disciplines has over time become the core issue in the humanistic debate. The second point, I think, where we have a decisive difference is that all humanistic data is indexable. And all humanistic phenomena, what we regard as a phenomenon, is indexable. That is, it always points back to us as the perceiving subject. It has this particular component. I don't really think that Heisenberg apart, of course that's again the principle of discussion, but I don't think that a physicist looking at an instrument reading will at that point in time contemplate how this relates to his own identity and so forth. I do that when I read a Shakespeare poem, and I can't get away from it. So I think that is something that should be specific about humanistic data. And the third point, and that's really interlinked with that second one, is historicity. The data that we deal with always comes with a timestamp and a shelf life. And we know that. And that's how our disciplines have over time always dealt in what we're dealing with. We know that ideas change, that value systems change. And we sort of touched upon that earlier on when we talked about schema. They also change over time. But I think that this is a very specific element of humanistic data modeling that we should perhaps pay more attention to. That our data is data that is valid over a defined period of time, that is, it sort of carries this historical index with it. And to my mind, we haven't really come to grips with that issue until now.
Maybe Chris anticipated a little bit of my question, or I just wanted to add this dimension of well, the process of creating data in the humanist area. So I think there are data. There are data in a way equivalent to data in the natural sciences and engineering, in that you collect data and use it. So when you have a project today with maybe historians, art historians, they collect data and they use the data very similar to maybe the people using data for the weather forecast or geologists. They use data to make corollaries out of that. And it works in a way the same way. And so you can use a text as data, but you can use a text as a product of a humanist. He wrote some text, which is his result. But at the same token, it's his data for the next book, so to speak. So you have to distinguish between what you call the data phenomenon distinction, which is a heuristic distinction, and data as a collection of usable data for something else. And this is a very important dimension when you look at tools being created in the last couple of years. You find something like annotation tools becoming very important. I refer to this very interesting book of Peter Booth, which he called Mesotext. I think this is a very distinctive data for humanists, collecting annotations, for instance, to use these annotations to create something else.
I think this also bears on the question that comes up of whether data is scholarship. In other words, your point that data can function both as a kind of output when we take the model seriously as a form of scholarship, and then also can be an input in ways that may alter its nature. I think that's an important point.
I think, Chris, we think that probably I'm taking the opposite stance now, that there is no real distinction on this level between what we are doing and what people in natural sciences are doing. Because even if you're touched by a Shakespeare poem, you wouldn't usually write it into your essay but tell it to your students or whatever. I mean, it's not the same on the same level as the scholarly research we are doing. And I think it's probably more clear to say the data we are using to explore the world behind the data, which we are really interested in, as you pointed out, the concepts, the ideas, and so on. The relationship between finding something in the natural sciences and the relationship between the data there and the phenomena they're really interested in, and the relationship between what we are really interested in and the data we have is different. But not our handling of them, or basic understanding of the data and so on. But it's just behind this. It's how do we construct the relationship between the data and the things we're really interested in. And I think understanding this kind of, because it's another aspect of data modeling, saying how do we model our data in a way that it allows us insights into what is happening behind them. That is really the question, and I think there humanities may be different because we have intentional agents and everything.
I think it would be useful for this this group over the next few days to consider sort of functional domains for humanities data, because I'll say I'm a librarian. I'm not strictly a humanist in the sense that many of you are. And one of the things that I personally struggle with on a regular basis is sort of making data play well with other data. And that's a functional element of humanities data that I think, frankly, a lot of humanities data does not do well. It is not functional in that sense, by and large. And it may be very functional for the purpose of enhancing a scholar's insight about a given object or corpus or phenomena. But as functional data within an ecosystem, which I think is more and more, and I'll go back to the networking idea, is more and more a networked ecosystem, a truly networked ecosystem, where semantics and phenomena are in fact the sort of objects that are interacting. I think that humanities data, at least a lot of it that I've seen thus far, has a long way to go, and I think that derives from the fact that it's created as a function of the scholar's interaction with the object or the object of study, as opposed to scientific data, which is created for a single, possibly multiple functional purposes that are sort of at a different stratum from the scholar's interaction with the actual object. So I think that it would be useful for this group to just sort of consider functional domains for data, if only to sort of clarify what the scope of each discussion may be.
Can I just say something in response to that? So I would want to tie it in with what Chris was saying about some disciplines having an applied perspective. So in the natural sciences or in physics or whatever, that I think one thing that will be a challenge to humanists is thinking about how we model data through experimental design. So if we're thinking about our data having a functional purpose or an instrumental purpose or an applied purpose, then we're thinking like public humanists. And increasingly we hear that term being thrown around, a shift toward the public humanities, that it's not simply about getting insight into our own data that is then revelatory for us and a handful of readers, but rather that we're creating data models that can be useful in some way to a larger community. And in the sciences, what they do is they design experiments to try to understand how the potential user community models or understands the data. So they do focus groups, they design instrument surveys, they do interviews, and then based on the user community's understanding or their own data model, they then design tools and services on top of that. And we're simply not trained to do that in the humanities. We don't know how to do those kinds of experimental designs. When we talk about the digital humanities and we talk about curricula for it, we always point to things like programming or technological skills. But things like statistical understanding and experimental design, I think, will become increasingly important as we make that shift toward the public humanities, as we think of that applied perspective, that functional perspective, or that instrumental perspective.
I totally agree. I think that's the key point. Basically, what we don't do in the humanities is we don't simulate, we don't model in a numerical way, not in terms of data model. Basically, if you want to understand the data, right, we need to actually model the processes going on which lead to the construction of the data in order to understand what's going on. That model may be wrong. That's what the scientists do, right? But they come up with a better model. But they don't. They're not doing the same thing as we do. What we do is we interpret data, which is not a tool for forecasting and prediction. And that's a big problem we have, actually. And I think there is nevertheless a glue, which is, as he said, data more and more comes in the same kinds of formats. We find out there is an ecology of complex networks, which we have to understand. We have similar problems with our data, right? If a natural scientist produces a visualization, he has to interpret the visualization in the same way an art historian would interpret an Albrecht Altdorfer painting, right? It's because there is these kinds of things, right? How do you construct a visualization? If it's literature curated data you have in the first hand, some cancer may be very, very frequent and your dot may be very, very large due to the fact that a lot of research is going on in the cancer, while nobody ever has the cancer, right? At the same time, cancers which are super frequent but there's no research are super small. That's a very, very frequent phenomenon. So that's a hard sell towards the natural scientists, and it's equally a hard sell to say, okay, we did something like, say, master or PhD in the humanities. We didn't learn statistics. That's wrong. It's really wrong, because once we have a lot of data, we actually have to do statistical tests if certain kind of arguments we derive from the data are true or false.
Maybe just to add another perspective to the question, what's specific to the humanities, would also be to say, okay, our objects are X, Y, Z, and are there any other disciplines that also analyze these objects, X, Y, Z, a text, images, and so on? And I think there are. So when you look at computer science, or one part of computer science in the last 10 years or so, it has developed a field that's called text analytics, right? So you analyze large amounts, collections of text, and you're not just interested in finding patterns in the signal, but you're interested in what kind of knowledge is expressed in the text. What are the facts that are expressed? What are the opinions, like opinion mining, and so on. Now, so if there's that field, text analytics, let's call it that, is that something we're also interested in, or is that completely different? Yeah? Is that something we don't ever ask about a text or a text collection? Just.
Another thing I think we should remember is that our objects are multi-layered in a sense. They do have, most of them, an aesthetic value that is offered to the general public for their private enjoyment, okay, or for educational purposes. Most of them has this aesthetical level that private pleasure, reading and when Shakespeare, as we were saying. That is a very fundamental point, what is different of our object in respect to humans, because when we model, when we datify this object, we don't datify that, the aesthetical experience. We do deal with other aspects of that, you know, the date where they were built, the structure, the term. We have invented in the last few centuries of positivism way for analyzing this object in a structural, objective way, and that's what we are trying to model. This we are going on the same line of the structure, finding the function of the character, what they do, how they move, who say what, the language of that. Because we are trying to datify this object, but we cannot. As far as I know, I haven't seen anybody able to datify the enjoyment, the pleasure that reading a poem or seeing a beautiful paintings or a sculpture in our building is able to give. So the point is that is the absurd that we are trying to do in a sense. We are trying to capture what doesn't feel, and what is the value of the object that are there is that they feel. They make you feel something. So in a sense that we are going to, their value is both cultural, if you wish. We can come to the structure inside, but it also is personal, and is something that we are not able to do. We haven't done, in a sense.
There's a huge movement for the last 50 years doing study on emotional aspects of literary texts, and so that's not new. They come from discourse analysis. They're doing a lot of cognitive studies at the moment. So they're doing exactly this, and probably you could really encode it because they're trying to find codes in the text, or relation between codes, cultural codes, and things and expressions in the text. So these studies are being done at the moment.
Yeah, but not by the humanities people.
Actually by the humanities people, and at least in Germany.
I think I think the major mistake there is to say the humanities people or the natural scientists. I'm working with both very closely, and I have met people who are incredibly basically almost racist towards anybody who bridges disciplines in both camps. And I think we cannot generalize, but it's true. I think there's Twitter Mood, there's a flash map by Fernanda Viegas, for example, where they actually measure stuff on a quantitative way, which is very, very surprising what it tells us about us. It's the same thing, right? You use computer science methods and you find something out about yourself, which is awesome, I think. And there's more and more such interest across the board, because obviously the people who do physics, who see that they can apply their methods, the very same, they study Bose-Einstein condensation in some material, and then now they can apply that to society and actually find out something. And that obviously is because they're interested in society, just as the interpretative hermeneutic humanities person is interested in the very same thing. And yeah, I think it's interesting because those people sometimes go way farther than we do.
Right? I'm hearing kind of a point being made here about identity politics. I mean, in a sense, there is an identity politics operating within the humanities that drives, and I'm going to deliberately overgeneralize here, the humanities, in a sense, as a kind of official voice of what constitutes humanistic inquiry, properly speaking, and that sort of sense of the value of that boundary as a defensive layer, I think has a long history. What strikes me about it is that the point, oh my goodness, I can't remember, the point about whether, it was Andy's point about whether, in effect, data models in the humanities are intended to put data into conversation, right, to create a more publicly useful kind of data-driven discourse, or whether the purpose of a data model is to allow an individual to represent adequately his or her own insight about things. I think that's, in a sense, at the heart here. I mean, when the humanities, in the old-fashioned sense, receive word from the digital humanities that the humanities needs to, that there's some imperative to move our frame of operation into a more linked space, a more commensurable space, a space where we can actually use our models to study what we're doing. I can imagine an identity politics response from the humanities saying, in effect, not only is that not what we do as a matter of identity, but also that that is going to operate to the detriment of our ability to think the kinds of individual scholarly thoughts, in other words, to do the kind of scholarly research we've been accustomed to. And I know that within the TEI, which is the data modeling universe I'm most familiar with, that I think is in a sense the central problem of whether the model is in service of private expressiveness or interchange. And I think it's really interesting to see it coming up here. And I think, in a way, a question we may not be able to answer, but we can certainly talk about, is to what extent is there an imperative, and what would be the value to the humanities of either moving in that direction or not moving in that direction? Like, how could we measure that value? How could we build it into our sense of the role of the humanities in the public discourse, the role of the humanities in culture, those kinds of things?
I just want to respond briefly and say that the comments that I was making about data being linked are not solely sort of for the greater good of other disciplines in the general public. I think that that is a side effect, but I wonder if there's anything essential about humanistic inquiry that would not itself benefit even the individual scholar from having that data be linked in ways that are not looking inward at the object of study, but looking outward at its relationships.
Yes. I want to pick up on that too, because I think that what Jolie just said is actually really important. But at the same time, as I see it, a lot of the stresses that we face are expressions of a natural anxiety with a change that's happening around us, which in many ways is simply there to be dealt with. It's not something that we are really much, as individuals, right? Our question is not, is this change going to happen, but how is it going to happen? And how am I going to happen? That's the most old-fashioned humanistic question of all, right? I mean, it's within that context, I think that that it's really not an either-or consideration, right? The reason I do digital humanities is because I want to do humanities. The digital humanities happens to be the form that I do it in because I also live in a digital world. So I have no problem at all with a scholar who wants to continue to do the old-fashioned thing. I think that's great, and more power to him. So to me, these questions of how is it that we address the modeling exercise, and to what extent we're making this public, and what extent we're seeing practical value in it, and so forth. Those are just the same questions that the humanities have been facing all along. And with respect to that, let's remember that the sciences came out of humanities, because we've been doing this since the Renaissance, asking these questions. My feeling about that is kind of, come on in, water's fine. Right? It's not really that they're, I understand why we feel the stresses, but I also don't feel that there are stresses that are anything particularly new. That I think that, by asking the kinds of questions that we're asking, we're actually moving this forward, if only to discover that we're not the only ones who have to.
It's worth noting, though,
the impression that we've got a very reductionist picture of the humanities, because, for example, where are the languages? I'm doing corpus linguistics, for example. It's not just all about emotions and beauty and things like that. And so I do digital humanities, and I think linguistics belongs to digital humanities. At least I want it to be there and not somewhere else. I do digital humanities because it allows me to ask completely different questions, to have all these relationships, have a lot of data, and get a more holistic knowledge, also impression of what there is actually. Between languages and societies and history, I don't know what. I mean, all these sort of things which we could not do before. So that's what I'm interested in.
I think it's worth noting, as a matter of historical consciousness, that what we're calling the old-fashioned humanities are, historically speaking, the very, very new humanities. You know, I mean, this idea that interpretation is central is in fact a defining activity of humanistic inquiry. You know, data modeling, as far as I can tell, is what the humanities looked like, you know, more or less between the 16th and 19th centuries. I mean, there was a time in humanistic scholarship, so-called, where, you know, publishing a book of Greek cognates was a perfectly acceptable, excellent act of scholarship, and in fact, what you should do. That's what the humanities is, you know. So I mean, and actually, I think if there are identity crises and worries about, you know, questions about is data modeling scholarship, and perhaps the answer is no, and that could be bad. You know, I think you know, a lot of that is actually the present contemporary humanities' fear of its own past, because it looks for all the world like this thing that the humanities, you know, definitively destroyed forever after the Second World War. I mean, there was a real reaction. I mean, anything that, I mean, the list of things that are, you know, not really the sort of thing upon which we can build a tenure case are exactly those things that the humanities did for hundreds of years. So I mean, you know, we're up against massive historical forces here when you start to talk about, you know, data modeling scholarship as a political and as a matter of identity. I mean, you know, it's the present humanities that are the newfangled.
One thing that we haven't touched on yet, but that relates to Andy's question about the functional perspective on data modeling, relates to sustainability. And one of the questions about not just fear of the past, but also fear of the future, and relating this to the hard sciences, is that right now it's easier to redo the genome of a mosquito than to recover the data about that genome that was done a year or two ago. We're in a position now of having to get old-fashioned in order to push things forward, because the ways that we engage in this sort of discourse is by slapping flat images of the user interface into a scholarly article and talking about it. And that may be where we're stuck at the moment, but I see a future maybe 50 years from now when we're looking back at the landscape of littered failed projects, when we actually want to lift them up and use them and try and recover what was going on with that data model, much of which is full of implicit assumptions that were never unpacked, that are invisible to us, you know, software dependencies that are gone. And as a librarian, I share the concern of trying to get the data to play nicely together, not just now, but also off into a future in which people will be coming to libraries and asking, give me that.
I think that's a very, very, very interesting point, and it reflects what Tim Berners-Lee always says about the initial stages of the World Wide Web, where the data huggers would close their websites, so would only give the address to people who would know them, and they would not link out to other pages because they were jealous about their page. And these were obviously the sites who were forgotten, right? Because obviously the linking is exactly what keeps you going. It's the same thing. We know how many Greek texts do we only know because some other Greek author said there is this text by this other guy, and but that also produces a kind of imperative that we actually have to, as the people who produce data models, as the people who produce data, if I analyze data, I also produce data, obviously, right? To actually publish them in the right way. So there is no infrastructure right now, which is simply political infrastructure, because technically it's totally possible. Any kind of data, any text data can be published in some XML format, in RDF, the data model can be dumped somewhere in something which can be read in 20 years and stuff like that, right? And I'm pretty sure if there's enough of this stuff, probably there will be even historians of data, right, who will actually do nothing else but study this kind of thing. But right now, we are still in this phase where people are still reluctant to actually give out the data. To give you an idea, I'm currently working with person data, and the proprietary data sets I get are 2 orders of magnitude larger than what is in Wikipedia. Everybody's free to put any kind of person into Wikipedia, but people don't. And that's a very important message, I think.
Yeah, I think we should have no problem of identity, because we're not the first one to go through exactly this phenomena. We spoke about natural science, we spoke about physicists. Look at astronomers. 30 years ago, astronomers would go to an observatory, look at the thing, and make observations. Then they took benefit from photography, they took benefit from digitization. Now they observe along various ranges of how do you call that? Wavelengths. And they've got observables, like we have observables now as we go digital now. And those observables change form. I mean, there's notion of surrogates, it's just another way of having observable. And now people, instead of going to archives now, would rather have these observables on site. You know that nearly, yeah, that's what the latest figure I had, 80% of the astronomers do not ever go to an observatory. They don't have that, they just open their computers and compare wavelengths and do observation to a certain place because they know they've got those databases. That's probably what we dream of for humanities as well in the long run. So it's not an issue. And I think data modeling is a way, and they are doing data modeling as well, to say, look, I've got those observables, I want to reconstruct some kind of phenomena, so the phenomena are on the other side for me. It's not the observables proper. And what are the mechanisms we use, what are the tools we have to correlate bandwidth, wavelengths, oh my English. So to correlate wavelengths across dictionaries and words which occur in text, for instance, or what have you. So it's really a matter of having a methodology. So forget about identity. We need to know what we're doing now to achieve this, to be not the observers of what's going on in digital humanities, but the actors of changing the methodologies of defining new observers.
I just wanted to respond to Steve. I wanted to respond to Steve a little bit because you referred to how data modeling was what humanities did. And yet one of the really interesting things is that when we take that modeled data and try to use our tools or squeeze it into our models or modeling instruments now, we realize how it was not consistent. It did not actually map beautifully to these structures that either scholars then, or at least we now, apply to it. Anybody who's tried to mark up a classical dictionary, for example, dictionaries, structure, the Oxford English Dictionary, structure. No, they're not. They're not structured at all, actually. So I think that raises, I'm not trying to say that that people didn't do modeling back then, but that the model, what we are calling modeling, or what was called technology of scholarship, doesn't map as simply. And maybe that goes back to Laurent's statement about looking for what are the tools that let you do that. The flip side of it is that we may feel that these models were not consistent because our tools expect something that is not appropriate for that kind of data or that kind of modeling. So I don't know if the answer is, but I think from the trenches of trying to work with XML and classical text or something, one starts to think not that the one is right, the other is wrong, but the fact that there's a difference or an inconsistency is where we might want to look for some meaning in what we do when we model humanities data.
I think that's important to keep in mind. I mean, I think we've all faced that issue that we see this commonality between the activity of the 18th century philologist and then ourselves, and then we discover, oh, wait a second, that mapping is problematic. But to say that mapping is problematic is not to say that it does not map, right? And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about markup as a heuristic activity, as well as markup as being, something that is intended to come up with some sort of product. And that, I think we talked about this for years in the context of digital humanities and what are we doing, in that there's something about our modeling, the self-consciousness that we bring to the modeling activity is partly the consciousness of how interesting it is when the models fail, and how necessary it is to pay attention. Not just because we want to improve the model. I mean, yeah, there's that.
but also because it's also telling us something about the phenomenon under observation. You know, that's something which I think really speaks to a lot of these issues that we're putting together here, because it's you know, it's where the problem sort of folds in on itself, right? Because, you know, we have text, we're modeling text, and text is the thing that we're using to model the text with. And so we get back to these issues where there's no escaping the, you know, the box that we're inside of, and we're in a larger box. But it's, you know, it's been like that for a while. That's not, you know, and I think that is something.
Can I just take that up before? Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt. I've been listening to the last few comments, and I'd like to say something that I think if we're going to put subjective judgments about texts, or what we regard as our interpretation or model, into the text, mingling it with the text, we're always going to have this problem about trying to reuse data to download the wavelengths or whatever Laurent was talking about. We need to be like the astronomers and just say, oh, we'll pick this text here, we'll pick this interpretation, or indeed a model of a text, and we'll merge the things together and we'll get some kind of output that gives us lots of different possibilities. But while we're still mixing it together and fixing it in there, then we're stuck with this problem of interchange, that is to say interoperation after conversion with possible damage of the text. What we actually want is literally interoperable text that we can just load into software, use, put back, get someone else's. We haven't got that at the moment.
That's it. May I add on that? So basically, I think this is also an epitome of how digital humanities projects are often structured. There's always this kind of component of like, let's build a tool which does the analysis on top of it, right? So there's some people digitize something, they bring data together, and then one work package, say in a new project, would be to actually build a tool which basically would analyze that kind of thing and produce nice little network pictures. But the point is that's not how it works, because we don't know the structure of the networks. We don't know if the actual community finding algorithm isn't actually bad, because that would be found out 2 weeks later where another paper comes out. And I think basically what we need is something like a modular kind of system where people can actually collect data, apply different models to the data, and actually analyze the data and do basically the same thing the scientific process has done with papers, right? So basically people publish a result, you take all of the results ever made, you write another paper and you put it back in where it belongs to. And I think that's something which is not done in any kind of digital humanities project, especially like the legacy ones which run for, say, 10, 20 years, often have this kind of thing. What they are doing in their particular point of what they're doing, say, antique reception, is the database doing that kind of thing. But there may be other scholars who have different ideas, come up with other algorithms, have a slightly different angle, produce another data set. And I think that's the kind of thing we need, just as in astronomy, people, they agree on the raw data, but what's going on after that is like super different for most of the people.
Let me ask you, what's the raw data we're using? Is it just a pile of strings, or do we have a cultural construction of what our raw data is? And the digital libraries really are trying to reconstruct this cultural construction in a way, so that we all have the same basic ideas, what's important about it. We're not there, so we're talking about two different data models at the same time here. One is the data model digital libraries offer. They have very strong understanding what people need. At the other hand, we have this open-minded process where people say, I have an idea what could be interesting for my research, and throw something at the text. And are these completely different things, and should we use different techniques, and we have different demands on requirements?
I think this goes back to this, it's very similar to this discussion versus top-down kind of classification librarians with a predefined thesaurus versus people tagging stuff, right? Twitter hashtags, for example. And the interesting thing is, if you analyze quantitatively, you see it's two different things. And there is a lot of quality in what librarians do with predefined kind of classification systems, but there's also some gap. They don't get certain things, right? Because simply they don't have the classifications in their system, or it's not within their cognitive limit what they want to look for. And the Twitter hashtags have the problem that there is so much noise that actually you need a lot of data to actually filter out some structure, right? And that noise is something humanities doesn't talk about. at all, right? Noise is something which is really interesting because always, as a single scholar, we're always operating below the noise threshold. Right?
Well, and in the humanities too, we interpret noise as signal.
Yeah, exactly.
Talk about sonnet form as a model that you could implicitly validate a poem against without being able to look at it and say, no, that doesn't meet the rules. So sonnets don't really exist in nature. Critical additions don't exist in nature. And I don't know that distinguishes us from more technical in math. Matrices don't exist in nature either. So we can make this stuff up and go from it.
We've been talking about modeling either implicitly or explicitly in text. But what about non-textual data?
What about non-textual data?
So, I mean, you could see possibly for an art historian, yes, it makes sense to model non-textual data. But what about, for example, literary scholars or modeling the historical record, but not with text, but building other kinds of non-textual models to do what Elizabeth was saying, ask new questions about the objects that we study. So I just wanted to ask.
A very simple answer from my side is like, if you put enough zeros and one on top of each other, you don't see the difference anymore. So the discontinuousness of digital data becomes something continuous, right? And the other thing is like, if you look at cognition science about like how syntax is built up, right? There's like, it's strongly nonverbal. There's a lot of motor thing going on, which is totally not digital, right? At least in effect. And yeah, I think you're right. That's a discussion we have to do, right? So because all the data we work with in the digital humanities is usually translated to textual data. And you can actually see that in the funding landscape, and you can see that at conferences. The MLA, this year Modern Language Association, had 26% digital humanities sessions. The Historians Association had, I think, between 16 and 20. And at the College Art Association, there was one session which practically did digital humanities, and one other session which talked about it out of 100 sessions. This is amazing if you take into account that the arts are, a lot of the, even the tools scientists work with in terms of digital data comes out of arts colleges, like, for example, processing, the graphical visualization language. It was done by artists and designers, right? So I think that's a very legitimate question, and I think my personal point of view in this point is that actually the people who deal with non-textual data should make a stronger case that they are also a part of digital arts and humanities, and they also, I think they should also have a part of the digital humanities funding in the National Endowment of Humanities, for example, which is not much money, by the way.
I want to just say something. I'm going to reinterpret Susan's question and then answer it. I don't even know if this is really, it feels relevant to me that for, I mean, first of all, I hope that we're not here to talk about XML. I hope we're here to talk also about GIS, and we're also here to talk about relational databases, and we're also here to talk about image data models and image processing systems and all of that. Because one thing I notice about the XML ecosystem is that it doesn't look like any of these other things. Those other things have way more in common with each other than with the XML ecosystem. And the XML ecosystem does have a privileged place in the humanities. I mean, it is a focus of our attention. But XML as a technology, as a platform, doesn't look much like relational database systems. It doesn't look much like GIS systems. It doesn't look like the R environment. And yet, all R, GIS, and SQL, all as a practical matter, share enormous similarities just in the way you interact with data. For example, in SQL, the line between the language you use for data modeling and the language you use for processing almost vanishes at a certain point. Whereas that's actually a pretty hard line in XML, despite the fact that XSLT is homoiconic with respect to XML. Forget that for a moment. I mean, XSLT is a different kind of thing from XML tagging. GIS systems, that's not true. It's not true in SQL, it's not true. I mean, that seems to be a really big question. We better have a very good reason for that. Like, we better have an excellent reason for why that's so, because, because that's striking to me, that just the way you deal with data modeling in these other domains, including image processing, very different, very, very different. Either. Well, I'm more looking for rationale, but I mean, I'll take either. I think I know the historical reason, but I mean, I'd like to have a good rationale.
Can you expound on that? Because I'm not tracking that at all. I do not understand. I would have said that A, there is a line in SQL between the data definition language and the data manipulation language. Maybe that's just because I hang around with a bunch of SQL geeks for whom that distinction is an important one within the SQL language. But I would also have said, to the extent that there are similarities and it feels like one language, maybe it's the way my head has been bent.
Well, I mean, here. I guess first of all, the data definition language and the data manipulation language in SQL are literally the same definition. They're the same language. But also as a practical matter, I mean, in all these cases, you open up a shell, and conceivably, you open up a shell and you can work in either. You go back and forth between processing and data definition like this. That is not true in XML. I don't think. It can be true. Well, like how? Well, it could be, but it's not. I mean, this seems to be the important thing, and this is a we're going down earth here with a very practical issue about how people work, about workflows. Our workflows are very different.
Right,
it really is.
This is exactly what I was speaking to with my two workflow graphs, because as I see it, the ossification, right, the fossilization of a particular processing model in XML, privileges schema design up front to such an extent that the schema becomes the be-all and end-all, actually impedes and prohibits much of the activity of data modeling which we claim to be interested in as humanists. And that is actually not even necessarily the case with XML, to say nothing of the other possibilities of other technologies. It in fact is possible to use XML in a very different way, but part of what Desmond is speaking to is that because of the nature of the architecture of XML, it then forces you, at a later point into, a monolithic hierarchy that then prevents the kind of interactive relationship with the text and with interpretations over the text that we all know we want.
You might be making a stronger statement to me. I mean, because I'm not sure I'm not sure that the model we have precludes the workflow. You seem to be saying it's in the nature of XML. I don't know if that's true. If that's true, that's a thunderous revelation.
Well, but when I say that that's the case with XML, what I'm saying about is that's the case with XML as an historical artifact that's evolved in a certain particular direction. Not that it's necessarily the case with XML-based technologies, which I do know that people are using in different ways. And it just happens to be the way it's usually done, very likely. And for the most part, for very legitimate, proper reasons, because that has to do with the scalability of the publishing system. As opposed to the kind of system, for example, that Chris is interested in, which is much more dynamic, interactive, malleable, fluid, which you don't want a publishing system to really be like that.
Well, I want to say, I don't know. Having never had that system, I don't know. I mean, I'm serious. I mean,
let me put it this way. You might want one, and I, in fact, want one, but I know plenty of people who want to control things a little bit more.
But I'm always suspicious of that. What people want. I'm a software engineer.
Well, all right, they come to me and offer me money to help build it.
I think we're in a very important point, and I think we could generalize the discussion a little bit further. If you just abstract from like what kind of relational SQL, XML, what we use, there is this one kind of tradition where people actually create a data model. They have some form of a card where you have a field where you say spouse, children, whatever, right, stuff like that, and that basically defines the relation between two people, right? And so if you go to the other end of the spectrum, you could actually, there's this kind of data, if you make it super abstract, you have like, on one hand you have the nodes, that's the people, and on the other hand you have the links with the link types, that's 2 tables, you don't need more. And then basically the guys who enter the data could actually come up with link types as they go, which is, if you look at historical documents, often very, very good, because there's a lot of link types the data modeler beforehand couldn't even think of, right, because he didn't know the text. So on the other hand, there are certain things you want to have beforehand, right? You want to have the spouse of every person who applies for a visa, for example. So there is this kind of 2 uses. It's useful in both cases. But what's the important point about it is, like, if you do this kind of thing that you allow for data modeling on the go, you actually get a benefit, because every user, even without thinking or not being supposed to think about the data model, can actually expand the system, and then in the end you can measure how relevant is that. There's obviously, there will be a couple of link types which will be consistently very important for this data set, and then there will be a long tail, I mean that's at least for the data sets I know, there will be a long tail of link types which are, like noise, right? So because people call spouse Ehegatte, even though it's an English database, right? So some errors you can correct, some you can even correct automatically, but some you can't. And maybe the tail is something interesting. It will be 1/3 of your data, and this 1/3 may be interesting to some scholar who's interested in how the noise is distributed. So I think we should do both. We should not have the conversation, should we model beforehand or should we model afterwards? We should actually do it the entire game. And say, okay, spouse, that's what I want to know all the time, but you can enter whatever you want, and then you find out that most personal relations are personal circle. Nothing, right?
Well, I agree with that, and I also think that that's essentially what Desmond is talking about when he talks about a system that is able to support the activity of interpretation and the activity of expression, and at the same time not lock the data into that in such a way that the data then becomes useless when the purpose of it is straight all out.
I just wanted to add to Steve's observation about the weird thing that we, on the one hand, look at the static aspects of modeling very much. If we look at XML, but we don't talk about the dynamics, about the processing. What I want to add is that in computer science, it's fairly normal actually that when you model computer systems, you have to take those aspects into account. Any modeling language, including the unified modeling language, said that the 2 views are complementary. So you cannot think of the static aspects of some computer system without taking the dynamic aspects into account. So in this regard, it really is quite being separated to the possible.
I really very much
that. Should I repeat it? So what he said is that in computer science there is it's built into like how you do modeling, that you actually have some kind of dynamic process going on, right? And I think it's very interesting to look at the difference here. There's a difference between humanities and natural sciences, which is really true. So the physicists have the PACS classification system. So basically, if they submit a paper, they have to classify their own papers, and then it's a result every year to calculate what's the structure of PACS. So what's the hierarchical structure of PACS? While in the humanities, in most cases, say for classical archaeology, the Deutsches Archäologisches Institut will define a tree, and they will give it to their librarians, and then they have to classify that certain way, and there is no other, so no archaeologist can ever contribute to that. And that went on for 50 years. And then they throw out classifications because they don't have enough librarians to actually do the classifications. Which means archaeologists would sit at home, go to thousands of books in one classification and say, okay, I need that, I don't need that, I don't need that, I need that. If they could classify themselves, it would be a very different story. So here, obviously, the data modeling in physics is way better, right? Because it's along that kind of line.
Thank you all extraordinarily much. This has been fascinating. And I think now we've earned our lunch, so let's clap.
Yeah.